So welcome everybody, and I'm Elsa Kronquist with the Heritage Museum. Today's speakers, Dr. Nancy Bristow, who is a Vashon Islander, professor of history at the University of Puget Sound and author of American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic, and Dr. Bruce Haulman, a Vashon Islander, retired professor of history at Green River College and author of A Brief History of Vashon. So, Nancy and Bruce, are you able to take it from there?
My name is Nancy Bristow, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about this massive pandemic of 1918 that until recently was largely unknown. This was a pandemic of massive scale. About a third of human beings across the world were infected, and we don't really know the numbers, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died worldwide. In the United States, 675,000 people perished, and the infection rate varied, but averaged about 28%. So more than a quarter of Americans were sickened in this. Next slide. I want to just situate myself as I start, because I think often it's helpful to know how someone came to their project. So this is a picture of my grandfather, John, and he was orphaned at the age of 15 over the course of 4 days in February 1920. In fact, his parents, next slide, were victims of this pandemic, the fourth wave, which struck in early 1920. It was my interest in understanding what had happened to my grandfather that brought me to the exploration of this pandemic, because I'd known him really well when I was young, but I'd never heard this story. And they were working class people, recently arrived Irish immigrants, and there was no way to restore their story without simply going out and doing a social history of what it was like to live through this thing. So that's how I come to the project. Next slide, please. When I got started, I realized very quickly that Alfred Crosby, who'd written the one really good book on the pandemic over the course of several decades, was right, that this really was America's forgotten pandemic, at least until COVID-19 showed up. So again, it became really exciting to try to make sense of this past world, because I remained convinced then, and even more so now, that this history can actually shed light on our own contemporary circumstances. So next slide. My hope is that today we can, between us, Bruce and I, talk a little bit about the past so that we have an additional lens for thinking about what we're going through right now. So next slide. I want to start with a story, not that of my family, but simply one person who suffered through the flu pandemic. And again, I want to do this because it will give sort of a human side to the numbers. You hear 675,000 and it just sort of is too much. When you talk about a single person, you can start to understand the story a bit. The woman I want to talk about was actually a teenager. Her name was Edith Potter, and she had just come to the Chemawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon. Her mother had sent her there from California. Chemawa was one of those original Indian schools that had as their, I would say today, horrific goal, the removal of the Indian from the young Indian child and a sort of forced Americanization process. So Edith was there. She was approved as a healthy child, entered the school, and on October 18th, the superintendent sent a letter home to her mother saying, your child has influenza, but don't worry. By the next day, they preemptively said, we can't wait for the letter, we better send a telegram, your daughter is very ill. And by the next day, next slide, Edith Potter had died tragically of influenza. Her mother was mortified and wanted desperately to have her daughter returned to her so that she could provide proper burial rites, but it was simply impossible, and she was prohibited from doing so for reasons we understand today, but reasons that were meaningless from the mind of Edith Potter's mother. Next slide. And I wanted to start with this story because her simple story, I think, actually reflects a lot of what people were going through during this pandemic, that the influenza traveled and sickened people really quickly. Edith Potter died in 2 days. Those who were sick and those who cared for them suffered really hard, devastating experiences, and something, again, that I think today we can really understand. But in addition, there was a kind of public chaos around this. Things didn't function the way they were supposed to. So for instance, Edith Potter's mother didn't get to bury her, and that made her suffering greater. And then finally, the issue that social identity really did shape how one experienced this pandemic. And again, I know that probably sounds a bit familiar. Next slide. By 1918, of course, influenza was really familiar. It was a domesticated illness. The problem with influenza is that it is constantly drifting and sometimes shifts, creating a novel virus that would strike with this new virulence because no one was prepared for it. No one had immunity. And that's what happened in the spring of 1918. Next slide. So the first wave probably originates in the American Midwest, which is why you won't hear me calling it the Spanish flu. We can call it the American flu if you'd like. It was largely unnoticed, though, as it swept through the United States, except by a few military medical practitioners, epidemiologists, and also just straight up medical practitioners in the army camps who were noticing something strange. They were not only seeing a lot of influenza, more than they should have in the spring, but the patients were also being hit with a kind of ferocity that was unusual among young adults. And also there seemed to be strange things happening in the lungs. They were kind of soggy and showed evidence of hemorrhaging. Next slide. Well, nobody paid much attention, as I say. Okay, some flu came through, but it wasn't actually noteworthy. There was not a single article, in fact, in the Journal of the American Medical Association about that first wave. But when the first wave got to Europe, where, of course, the Western Front is embroiled in war, people began to take notice. It traveled first to the British and the German troops. Pretty soon the French were sick. Not long after, the entire civilians around the European nation were infected. And that's, of course, how it gets the name Spanish flu. Spain wasn't in the war. They weren't practicing censorship. And so they reported on this first wave during the summer, hence the name Spanish flu. Next slide. But it was the second wave that has really captured our notice. And this is what people are usually talking about when they talk about the pandemic of 1918. This new virus exploded almost simultaneously on 3 continents, in Africa, in Europe, and in the United States. And over the course of just 2 months, as this chart suggests, it traveled from its landing place just outside of Boston all the way across the United States, so that even up here in the Puget Sound region, we too were fully embroiled in this flu pandemic. There would be a third wave that would follow the second, often in sort of late November, December, maybe January, February of 1919. And then in early 1920, people again seemed to sicken with what was either just another seasonal version of this, or perhaps people were suffering a fourth wave of the flu pandemic. Next slide, please. What's especially important to notice here is not only how virulent this was, killing so many people, affecting or infecting so many people, but also who it was infecting. As you can see on this slide, a traditional influenza mortality chart makes that W, the dotted line, because it tends to be the very young and the very old who die of influenza. That's true with our seasonal flu today. But in 1918, as you can see, there's this spike in the middle. And that's part of what's really important here, which is this pandemic was taking out the young and the healthy, the parents, the school teachers, the firefighters, the city council people. So it was encouraging a kind of social chaos as families had orphaned children, as schools lost their staffs, as those who were kind of the community leaders were the ones who were sickening and dying. About half of those who died were between the ages of 20 and 40. Next slide. And in fact, you can see here that the American life expectancy was dramatically on the rise, except in 1918, where it caused a loss in life expectancy by 12 years. So this is a really serious medical catastrophe for the nation. Next slide. Well, another thing that's important to notice is not only the numbers, but the ways in which this is really shocking for people. They weren't expecting this. They were used to the flu, but they also had the sense that they weren't going to be facing these kinds of infectious disease pandemics any longer. Though cities remained sort of awful places to live. Next slide. Thanks to the modern bacteriology, the bacteriological revolution of the late 19th century, they were now able to find the causal agents for many, many infectious diseases, those being caused by bacteria. So things like dysentery, malaria, scarlet fever, leprosy, bubonic plague, typhoid, whooping cough, bacterial pneumonia were things that they could now see through a microscope. Unfortunately, they can't yet see viruses. And so the reality is that they will look and look and look to try to find the causal agent this time, but they'll be unable to do so. So they are both disappointed in their own incapacities and also shocked that something so virulent has again come to the United States. Next slide. The other thing that's really shocking is how awful this disease was for those who had to watch it and those who had to experience it. And here I won't be too graphic, I promise, but I think we need to pause to think about what caregivers were going through. This is an era in which most people will be taken care of by their spouses or their mothers and fathers, or perhaps by their children or siblings. And what they had to witness was fairly horrific. it started with regular flu. It comes on somewhat quickly, but high fevers, headaches, weakness, pain in the muscles and joints. You know, we all know it. Flu is not any fun. Congestion, some people were really drowsy. A lot of people suffered really serious chills. Some people even had some nervous symptoms, is the way they described it. Next slide. Some people healed right away, as we usually do with the flu, but others would get worse. And in fact, their fevers would go up and they would enter a kind of delirious phase or perhaps even become unconscious. Next slide. And at this point, in fact, their lungs might begin to hemorrhage, their breathing would become really belabored. And then the worst part of all is that they would suffer sometimes nosebleeds, bloody coughs, and a discoloring of their extremities as they literally were drowning in their own bodily fluids. Next slide. So this was something that was very painful to go through, and also something that was very painful for family members and loved ones to witness. And they did witness it up close and firsthand. Now, it doesn't mean that Americans were without tools in 1918, and much of what we're trying to do today would be familiar to the people who went through the 1918 pandemic. Next slide. Doctors and nurses were in short supply, unfortunately, because of the war. Physicians didn't have much to offer. There were no medicines to cure. They could only treat symptoms. It was nurses then that were really the most important players during the pandemic, because they could at least help to make people more comfortable and provide the simple things, whether it's water or clean food or a blanket that could cover them and keep them warm. The Public Health Service played a really important role then, as it's doing today, and the Red Cross was essential, in fact. They took the lead in providing and organizing the volunteer nurses who would be the important caregivers all over the country. Next slide. Most important, perhaps though, for the Public Health Service was their effort to teach Americans some new habits. Again, sound a little familiar? I would think so. They would do many of the same things that we're doing today, interestingly reflecting the sort of immigrant nation that we were then and that we are today. One Red Cross pamphlet was actually published in 8 different languages. The 8 languages they chose at that point were Hungarian, Russian, Italian, Bohemian, Spanish, Polish, Yiddish, and English. Next slide. The kinds of things they'd be trying to teach people were personal, basic public hygiene, some things that are fairly familiar to us and we like to think we no longer do, like public spitting became outlawed. The common drinking cup. So when you would go to school, everybody would share the same cup in a classroom. Everybody might share the same cup in a train station. That was outlawed during the 1918 pandemic. And they were trying to teach people to do the simple things like sneezing and coughing into your elbow. That's right. But there were other restrictions, and again, these will seem familiar. Next slide. The first thing that many communities tried was closing public spaces, not allowing churches and schools or businesses to continue to operate. And there was a fair amount of pushback to this, largely by, again, school leaders, church leaders, and business leaders. But they also prohibited public meetings, dances, parades, theoretically, those kinds of things. Next slide. And of course, public masking. Again, here in some communities, it was actually required, and you could be fined if you were found without a mask. In this scene from Seattle, in fact, you can see one man being prohibited from entering the train because he's not, in fact, wearing his mask. Next slide. They certainly tried vaccines. We're hoping for one, I know, in the midst of our pandemic. In 1918, because they couldn't see the virus, because they did not have the technology, none of the vaccines were going to work. It didn't keep people from trying. And the mayor of Tacoma, for instance, was one of the great advocates for the use of vaccines, again, even though there was no way that vaccine would work. Quarantines, of course, were tried as well. And emergency hospitals opened up, again, something that we're seeing happening in some of the hot spots around this country. Emergency hospitals were set up all over the country. Next slide. And this is one of my favorite pictures, actually, for trying to understand what was happening. And if you just pause for a moment, you can see that the only people who are blurry are nurses, telling us again who was working the hardest in the midst. You'll see that family members were allowed to sit by the bedside of those who were sick, very different from what we're seeing today. And you'll notice that there are just many, many sick people, some of them simply children alone suffering through this illness. Next slide. The last thing I wanted to point out is then, like now, there was a differential impact. In 1918, we still had a segregated healthcare system, not only in the South, but in most of the North. So people of color were often relegated, for instance, to the basement of hospitals, or perhaps barred from the emergency hospitals altogether. Next slide. And the other thing that's really important to remember is that people also suffered through this if they were poor in desperate ways. This might lead to homelessness. It might lead families to be cold because they couldn't afford the coal to heat their home. Certainly, it often meant an inadequate diet. People didn't have proper nutrition often over the course of this. And it might mean that there was no one to take care of the sick. Without access to any kind of nursing care, the Red Cross reported again and again on families that they would find with multiple people sick and perhaps even someone who had already passed away, all in the same room in a single family dwelling of one room. So again, really dismal circumstances for those who are poor and for people of color in particular. To close, and then I'm going to hand off to Bruce, I wanted to just name 5 things I think we can learn here that we can talk more about later if anybody wants to. The first lesson is that 1918 teaches us, and I'm not sure we've learned it yet, how important it is to protect the most vulnerable among us. Second, next slide. We know that social distancing works. Let's practice this well, people. We know from 1918's evidence that it works. Next slide. We also know that the public will be most cooperative if they can really believe in their leadership, if the leadership can treat them honestly and provide them with reliable information. The president in 1918 certainly failed to do so in the person of Woodrow Wilson, who never spoke of the pandemic. And I fear at the moment we're suffering through this as well with the current inhabitant of the White House. And yet we have Tony Fauci, so perhaps it will be all right. Next slide. Fourth, it's really important that we're prepared. Something that I know, there are people on this island who are working very, very hard to make us prepared. Not all of us have stepped up early enough, but we're trying now, I think. Clear lines of authority are important as well. And then finally, last slide, it's important to remember all of the evidence, all of the research that's been done on those who survive traumatic experiences suggests that the ability to tell your story and be heard is really important to recovery, to rebuilding a life in the aftermath of catastrophe. So I think an important lesson that we can take away is how important it will be to listen to one another when this thing is over, but even as it's going on, allowing ourselves to hear the stories of those who are suffering. But enough about the national story. Let's turn it over to Bruce, where we can learn much more about what happened right here at home on Vashon Island.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. And in fact, Vashon is a microcosm of the larger nation. You know, a small, rural, fairly isolated community at the time. You know, automobiles were just coming in. Ferry service was still largely by the mosquito fleet. So Vashon was, you know, sort of a small, rural, isolated community. It might as well have been in eastern Washington or the middle of Kansas. But what's fascinating, Mike Sudduth and I have been working through all of the 1917, 18, and 19 newspapers to look at the impact of the flu epidemic on Vashon. And what we find is sort of a mirroring of what happens in the larger society. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of flu, of this pandemic flu on Vashon before the summer of 1918. But what's interesting is all through 1918, because the war is going on and because young men are in service all over the world, basically, but a lot here in Washington State, they're coming back to the island. And I think, Nancy, you've recognized in your book that for Puget Sound region, the initial infections came into Camp Lewis, now Fort Lewis, and into Bremerton Navy Base. You know, those were returning servicemen coming back from Europe or coming from bases other places in the United States and bringing the influenza with them. What you find when you look through the newspapers in that sort of spring and summer of 1918 is that almost every week in every community, there's articles, just one line, two line things. So-and-so came back to see their parents, or so-and-so is visiting their friend on Vashon. And I'm looking at Dockton. We're using Dockton as kind of a sort of example for the larger island. But just in August of 1918, there's these 5 young men, 2 at Camp Lewis, 3 at Bremerton, who are in service and are coming back to the island. And that happens all through the summer and into the fall. And so my suspicion is that that's the avenue, that's the vector in which the disease reached Vashon. Can't prove that, but it seems pretty logical at this point. So the flu arrives on Vashon, really that second wave that Nancy talked about. You don't see much in the summer. You don't see much on Vashon in the newspapers about influenza until August, September. And it's bad enough that by September 1918, Golgotha Lutheran Church suspended services for 8 weeks. Now, a lot of you will recognize that building. That's the current Heritage Museum. It was built in 1908. It's the Lutheran Church. And even though this photograph's from a little bit later, in 1918, they were concerned enough that they shut down for 8 weeks. So similar sort of things that we're seeing with what we're going through today. What I found fascinating, and sort of Nancy pointed this out, I mean, this was the beginning of sort of public health as a science in the United States, and that sort of reliance on doctors and medicine and science to sort of fight things like this. And although they weren't up to it because they didn't recognize it was a virus at that point, they were still putting out United States Public Health Service was putting out bulletins. And in October 17th, 1918, the Vashon Island Record, one of the 2 newspapers on the island, we had 2 newspapers for a short period of time on Vashon, actually published, almost a half of the page was taken up with this Public Health Service, a bulletin. And it just sort of ran through what recognizes the symptoms, you know, high fevers, cough, you know, those kind of things. If you're sick, stay home, don't go out. How to safeguard against the flu, don't go to meetings, don't be in public spaces, you know, fresh air. I mean, cover a cough and a sneeze that Nancy talked about, and stay out of crowds. Not very different from what we're hearing today. But the Vashon newspaper, the Island Record, takes half of the front page to sort of print this. So it's having an impact on the island. And then in October, it becomes bad enough that the schools close for 5 weeks. What's fascinating, and Nancy, you can talk about this a little bit, after the flu is sort of raging into the fall and early winter of 1918, but you have the armistice on November 11th. And it's sort of like, wow, the war is over, let's go celebrate. And so that often, I think, and many others think, that sort of emphasized that second wave in November and December, because they sort of broke the quarantine, if you will. And that's happened in Vashon schools. October, they shut down schools for 5 weeks. They open in mid-November for a couple weeks, and then they realize it's coming back. They close down, and they don't open until late January. So, and this is fascinating to me. This is a time when Vashon has 2 high schools. So there's Burton High School, which serves the south end of the island, and there's Vashon that serves the north end of the island. And then there's about 7 other school districts that run primary schools or grammar schools at the time. So it's not like in this pandemic where the school district covers the whole island and can shut it down. School districts were sort of deciding independently to shut down or not. And so it sort of exacerbated the problem a bit. And then in November 18, you know, using Dockton as kind of example, Dockton goes out and bans all meetings. Well, think about that a little bit. I mean, there's no community. I mean, there's a community of Dockton, but there's not a town of Dockton. You know, there's no mayor, there's no city council, you know, and all around the island, there's no governmental sort of agency except for King County and the state of Washington. So each community is sort of making decisions on their own about how to shut down, or can they shut down? And then who's making that decision? So it really is kind of a community-wide kind of effort. And reflective of what we're going through, I think, today. I mean, we get orders from the state, we get orders from King County, but essentially each community on Vashon has to make decisions about how they're going to sort of continue as a community. And that was very evident in Dockton and also all around the island. Nancy talked about it coming in sort of 2 waves. The first wave sort of coming in August, September, July, August, September, and then a second wave coming in November, December into the fall. And that was very true on Vashon. And it was a second wave on Vashon that was really the deadliest. as near as we can figure, and the records are not very clear, you know, the cause of death was not always indicated as influenza. It may have been something else, but what we can gather, looking through the death records, looking through the obituaries, there were about 25 people died on Vashon. But November to February, 4-month period, 15 of those 25 died. So it really was the peak, if you will. And as Nancy pointed out, with that sort of W curve, it really hit young people. So in November, Marjorie Van Alinda, 16 years old, dies in a period of about 3 days. Anna Busenich from Dockton and her husband died within 2 days of each other, both 30 years old, and they have a 3-year-old daughter. The daughter survives, but both of them die as a result of influenza, 2 days apart. So as Nancy pointed out, it was a very quick moving kind of disease. And for Vashon, it really hit hardest in that sort of winter of 1918, 1919. By January, starting to move out of it a little bit, Dockton records cases declining. There's still cases, they don't seem to be as severe. I don't know if that's herd immunity starting to take over or what, but you know, it's just the virulence starts to decline a bit. And so Dockton records declining cases, but also still continues to limit meetings and that kind of thing. And then by March, it's sort of fading out on Vashon. The last sort of major sort of infection is the Tahlequah, the Bridges family on the right-hand side with a beard is Matthew Bridges, the first European settler on Vashon. He lives on the island until 1927. He marries an Indian woman, a Shabab native person. And so his family, the Bridges family, is now still part of the Puyallup tribe. They're the last sort of major sort of infection center on Vashon down at Tahlequah. There's 2 more deaths into April. But basically by March, April, the influenza has swept through Vashon and begins to move on. Where are we today? Nancy, you might want to jump in here. It's a new normal, but what we can learn, and I think Nancy's 5 points are really very, very valid. It's a sense of we've got to take care of one another. We've got to be aware of how this is transmitted. We need leadership that steps up and that we can trust. And right now that seems to be an issue all over the country. And state leaders, national leaders, some are stepping up, some aren't. And it's a situation where I feel we are very fortunate. One, on Vashon, we're sort of isolated. We've got a moat around us. Not that a disease can't get onto the island, and there's already 4 sort of recognized cases on the island, but we're isolated to a certain extent. And we have a state government that has moved very quickly compared to many other states. So it's a new normal, and I just love this photograph of this kid. This is one of the women on Vashon who's making masks, and just a picture of her daughter. One of the things Vashon's doing to respond is it's been very interesting to watch the community response, and particularly around Vashon Be Prepared and the Emergency Operations Center, really organized, you know, several years ago, and they've run several sort of experiences over the last couple of years, all sort of focusing on the big earthquake that's going to hit. And what's fascinating to me is they actually have the mechanism in place so that when this coronavirus hit, they were able to mobilize very, very quickly. And the island has responded tremendously. It's interesting to see all of the activities, all over the island going on. Local communities, local people, clubs, organizations, and of course, Vashon Be Prepared, which is sort of coordinating a lot of the sort of official, the fire districts, all those kind of things. And how people are stepping up. Nancy's brother is part of the Reserve Medical Corps on Vashon and is responsible for the testing that's going on at the Mukai House and Garden. Well, Reserve Medical Corps last year had about 30 people signed up. Right now there's over 80. So medical professionals who live on the island have stepped up, you know, and they've more than doubled the number of people involved. So it's fascinating to watch what's going on the island. And I just love this. This photograph is from the food bank. And Jennifer Hawk, many of you may know Jennifer. What she did is she designed these sort of flower of life mandalas on the sidewalk, and they intersect 6 feet apart. And so they're asking people to stand at where those intersections are. And it's just a fascinating sort of artistic response, very Vashon sort of response to this. How do you do social distancing in a place like the food bank where people are coming to line up for food? And you can do it in just a line with 6 feet sort of markers, or you can do a mandala on the sidewalk. And so I think it's a reflection to me of some of the creativity that exists on Vashon and the artistic sort of spirit that people are moving into this. And then even Cool Gary, if you drive along the highway, even Cool Gary and his rabbit friend both have masks on. So Vashon's responding in some, I think, very, very interesting ways. And then Nancy has some suggestions for some nonfiction, and then the next slide, some fiction readings that if you're interested in learning.
And I can say just a word, Bruce insisted on putting my book up there. I might have left mine off to add some of these others. Laura Spinney's written a newer book that's a kind of worldwide look at the pandemic. Gina Colada's is perhaps, for me, the most interesting book about the search for the virus that leads eventually to the ability for Jeffrey Taubenberger to map the genome of the virus, which really, it's an exciting and really interesting story, very well told by the New York Times reporter Gina Colada. John Barry's The Great Influenza talks about the pandemic, looking especially at what physicians, I think, were doing during it. It's a more heroic narrating of the pandemic. And then Kenneth Davis's it really helps us think about the intersection between the war and the pandemic, which again is such an important part of the spread of the virus and the way people responded to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to add something, Bruce?
Well, I think people, because it was during the war, I mean, the flu hit the trenches in France very early on, but both sides were afraid the other side might have a military advantage if they knew the flu was in the other trenches. And so with military censorship, it was, and Nancy alluded to this, I mean, it was really, information about the infection was really suppressed. And it wasn't until it reached Spain that didn't have military censorship that it gets out and it gets the name the Spanish flu. You know, it's really probably originated in the Midwest of the US and was taken to Europe by American soldiers going to the Western Front. So it's a fascinating kind of intersection of war and disease and sort of creating that kind of perfect storm, if you will.
Exactly.
So Bruce and Nancy, we've got a couple questions here. Are you ready to take questions?
As soon as we see the last slide.
Let's do this.
Okay.
One.
And only because, at least for me, and Bruce, you can add in your own take on it, but for me, these are the two best fictional treatments. Catherine Ann Porter, who was a reporter herself in Denver and was in fact sick with the flu, and I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil her fascinating and beautifully told story of her experience of being herself a victim of the flu. And then William Maxwell, who was an editor at the New Yorker. So again, somebody who knows the craft of writing, wrote also a semi-autobiographical novella called They Came Like Swallows that details one family's experience of making it through the pandemic. And again, it's told with such humanity and grace and just humanity that it's well worth reading. And they're both quite short, but really powerful books.
Right. So let's conclude and then we'll move to questions. One of the things that Nancy emphasized, and I think it's important for us to sort of remember, is this value of remembering. In the 1918 pandemic, people wanted to get beyond it. The war was over, you know, it's sort of, let's forget it, let's get back to normal. And the cost of that, anybody that's worked with PTSD knows that the cost of it goes on for generations. And it's important for us to remember. We're living through a historical moment, you know, and a historical moment that none of us chose to live through. And we want to collect the museum, Vashon Be Prepared. We want to collect stories, photographs, experiences, you know, art, literature, music, whatever. And so what we've done is we've put together, along with Vashon Be Prepared, the Vashon COVID-19 Archive Project. to make sure that we don't forget and that future generations will have access to these archives. And so basically the museum is setting up an archive at Vashon Heritage Corona Archive, say that all fast in one way, at gmail.com, and vashonbeprepared.org/archives has an online archive where you can submit things. And we're looking at just collecting everything at this point. We're going to essentially create buckets that will dump stuff in, and we'll come back later and sort it and catalog it and index it and that kind of stuff. But what we're living through right now is we'll move quickly. It's already moved quickly. I mean, we're 3 weeks into it, and look at the changes that have taken place. And we want to make sure that those changes and how this plays out is captured so that we can go back and make sense of it, like Nancy has done with 1918. And so future islanders can come back and see how the island responded. Because as we talked about earlier, the responses are incredible. I mean, people are doing, Zoom concerts from home, are doing performances at home. People are having, block parties with everybody 6 feet apart on other sides of the road. I mean, all kinds of things are going on. And if we don't capture that, it'll be lost to the future generations. And so the project is really, I think, something that everybody can participate in. And so send us your stories, send us your photographs. Look at either of those sites, send them to the Vashon Heritage Corona Archive at gmail.com or vashonbeprepared.org/archives.
And we are so lucky to have both the Vashon Heritage Museum and Vashon Be Prepared on the island, and to be organizing this effort is really special. And so please, I hope people are hearing what Bruce is saying. I will put emphasis on the word he used of everyone. Everyone's story matters. It doesn't matter whether your family is sick or healthy, rich or poor. It doesn't matter what age you are, your story matters. We need everyone's story. So please do what Bruce is suggesting and share your experiences in whatever format, whatever medium works for you.
Great. So Elsa, this is a good time for questions. Elsa, are you muted?
I'm unmuted now, and I actually lost the screen, lost everything for a while. Do you have the questions in front of you?
Let me see if I can get to.
Well, Bruce, here's one for you. What was the population of Vashon in 1918? Do you know?
Yes, it was about 2,400. It had, interesting, Vashon had grown from about 900 in 1900 to almost 1,700 in 1910. So it had more than doubled. And it didn't quite double again, but it went up by about 60–70%. So 1900 to 1910, 1910 to 1920, huge growth periods for Vashon in terms of population. So 25 deaths out of a population of under 2,500, 1–2% kind of, and probably fairly typical of small, rural, isolated communities, very different than what you see in the cities. And that's what we're seeing today.
Well, and one thing that was interesting in 1918 is that those isolated villages and communities weren't always safe from the pandemic, even though we were so much less mobile. Right. I read a story of one village in Alaska of the Inuit people, and over the course of 5 days, 72 of the 80 residents died. So again, a little different in terms of in the cities, there may have been one set of problems, but somehow this particular pandemic also really hit rural communities, some of them very hard. Vashon was very lucky.
Right. Yep. Yeah, very much so.
So Nancy, here's a question for you. Could you speak more about Woodrow Wilson's response or lack thereof to the 1918 pandemic? And thank you both for your excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you. Great question. It's funny, I didn't really notice this as I was doing my research, but it turns out that Woodrow Wilson literally never spoke of the flu publicly, not on a single occasion, even as 675,000 people in this nation were dying of this pandemic. He was so preoccupied by the war. He was afraid that any attention to the pandemic would distract the American people from the ongoing war effort in Europe. Remember, the war ends on November 11th, 1918, right in the midst of the pandemic. So those closing battles of the war correspond exactly with some of the worst weeks of the pandemic. And he simply wasn't willing to distract the American people. Not only did he not share good information, but he also did some things that worsened the pandemic, because he did not halt troop movements, but continued to send troops back and forth to the front. And he didn't halt the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive, what Bruce had mentioned earlier, that in late October, because we pay for the First World War by way of government bonds, we have to kick off the Liberty Loan Drive with great actual patriotic pressure on people. And they held these massive parades in cities and towns all over the country. In Philadelphia, they hold a massive parade on October 28th, and by early November, they've got 600 cases a day. And there's no question that that very war effort was causing the disease to spread really well. So it was not good leadership on the part of the president. And again, like today, a lot of the really good leadership was seen at the county, the city, and also the state level. Thanks for that great question.
Mhm.
I don't know if anyone else can see the questions, since I seem to have lost them, but I do recall there was one that was talking about the schools and asking if you thought the schools would be closing in the fall.
I don't want to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. How about you, Bruce?
Oh, I don't touch it. Yeah, it's hard to know how this is going to play out, but I would not be surprised if school was delayed in the fall. There could be a miracle vaccine come along. I mean, there's all kinds of unknowns out there. But if this plays out as typical pandemics play out, and if we don't get some strong national leadership in how we're going to reopen, and if we reopen too quickly, we're going to see a second and a third wave of this that's going to take us into the fall and into the winter. And so, with those caveats, school could open in September, but unless there's some changes, if we proceed on the path that we're on with a sort of disconnected response nationally, and some very strong responses in some states and some very weak responses in other states, as we open up, viruses don't know boundaries. People are going to be moving around. So I would not be surprised to see a delay in school. But, again, we can control how this works out if we're willing to take the measures necessary. Right. Nancy, you want to expand on that?
Well, the one thing I would add is that in the world of higher ed where I live, this is a constant item of conversation. The national publication, the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is sort of our newspaper for people who are in academia, this is a daily conversation with institutions trying to be as creative as they can to figure out how to best serve our students. Dormitories are like petri dishes. So we really have to think carefully about the health and well-being of our students. First and foremost, their educations have to come second to that. Remote learning is not the same thing as in-class learning. We know that for those of us who are teaching at places like the University of Puget Sound with liberal arts education, really reliant on that close interaction among the learners alongside their professors. So we're missing that a lot, but I think people are working really hard, even though colleges and universities have gone to remote learning. There's a lot of good thinking going on, both in terms of how to make that work and also thinking about how can we be creative come fall. Do we do different ways of shaping the semester so that we're ready to be more flexible? There's a lot of good thinking going on, just as people have been reacting in really creative ways all along. I think we'll see that with what will happen in the fall, or I'm hopeful that there'll be some real creativity that will help to mitigate some of the really negative consequences this is having for education.
Nancy, this is from Elaine, who says, kudos to the UPS history department, my alma mater, and she says, thank you. And you good people on Vashon, yes. And she spent many wonderful days, summer days growing up here. And the question is, what did you learn about your grandfather's memory, etc., of the flu, and did you ever hear him talk about it?
I never heard him talk about it. I learned from my father on a backpacking trip in 1995, 25 years after my grandfather had passed. And it's a common phenomenon, as we were talking about earlier. This was something that really didn't enter the public culture. There weren't commemorations, there aren't memorials, there aren't things that call our attention to this earlier pandemic. My mother knew the story. I'm sure my father did as well. He was my father's father. But my mother was able to tell me the story of what my grandpa had told her. And apparently both of my brothers knew about my great grandparents dying, but I somehow had missed the story. Future historian in the making, maybe not so good as a child. I knew nothing about it. And so it's one of the many things I regret is I wish I'd discovered how much I love hearing people tell their stories. So I could have asked him all the questions I wish I could have had answered by him, but no, we never spoke of it. He died when I was 12.
The only other question was, there was a question, were we going to put this in our archive? And yes, we will be putting this in our archive. We will be putting in this online, the whole series at a later date. And
well, before we leave and close this down, I just want to really thank Nancy for willing to go through this process with us. We're all learning to Zoom around. And so thank you very much, Nancy. It's just
there's one other really great question here, and I'm sorry to interrupt,
Nope.
but and I had lost this earlier, so that's why I'm bringing it up here. What was the mobility of Vashon residents in 1918? Did the Central Highway exist? Did people get all around the island typically, or did they stick to small areas?
No, the Vashon Highway that we know today wasn't built until 1920s. So there were early roads. There weren't many cars on Vashon by 1918. There were a few, but not many. And roads were still mostly dirt. In fact, except for the paved highway from Center to the North End Ferry, there were no paved roads on Vashon until after World War II. So it's a very rural community, and it's very focused toward the water. And individual communities are very isolated. So people growing up in Dockton might have known somebody in Burton because the steamers ran back and forth, but they wouldn't know anybody that lived at Tahlequah or anybody that lived on the west side. You never knew people. And with two high schools, the North End and South End never really interacted except in football games, and that was to have sort of mini riots after each football game. So yeah, it was a very different sort of sense. And getting around the island, I mean, literally, it was easier to go from, say, Liza Beulah to Ellisport. It was easier to catch a ferry to Tacoma and then catch a ferry up to Ellisport than it was to get across the island. It was much easier to go by water. And so, yeah, each community was very isolated. And that probably helped. That's why, in individual communities, you had sort of pockets of infection, but it didn't spread all over the island like it would today.
So this is from Hazel. If even the president didn't talk about the pandemic, is it possible that isolated communities weren't aware it was a pandemic?
Most communities like Vashon were really reliant on local newspapers. So most communities, I think, would have been aware. Certainly there would be communities, for instance, up in Alaska or in really isolated mountainous areas who might not have known right away. And certainly there would have been native communities that might have been outside those lines of communication, especially up in Canada, other places in the world. But in general, the little communities of the United States at that historical moment, they all have at least one newspaper. And these newspapers are covering this minute by minute by minute. You'll know whose uncle is in town, who got married, and you know exactly how many people were sick, or not how many, but who was sick, whether they were recovering, who died. Those kinds of details, personal details, were absolutely the bread and butter of the small local newspaper. And so most people would have known in the United States.
And the local newspapers also were dependent on sort of what we call today the AP, the Associated Press. I mean, they got all these stories from the state level and from the national level. That's how they filled up their newspaper. I mean, there's a lot of local news, but they also had all these sort of packaged stories that came in from what was precursor of the Associated Press. So yeah, so there was information about the war, what was going on with the war effort, you know, what was happening all over the country. So yeah, I doubt that most communities, Vashon was certainly aware of what was going on.
So when you talk about media, Bruce, there's a question on that note. What role did news media, newspapers play during the 1918 pandemic at large? Had radio been adopted yet? And how does that contrast to the impact of today's online instant news media?
Huge impact. And Nancy, you can talk about this as well, but there are no radio stations in the Puget Sound area at that point, I don't think. Probably some crystal sort of broadcast stuff that amateurs are doing, but there's no broadcast radio. And so it's all newspapers. It's handwritten letters, you know, that people receive. So yeah, but the newspaper, like Nancy said earlier, I mean, the newspaper was the heart of the community. It was literally the news of the community.
And in some ways, I don't want to speak too much to the current situation because I'm not really a media expert, but I do think the way our news media has evolved over the last 10 or 20 years has really opened up an opportunity for a lot of sort of conspiracy theory and false information to flow. And for me, that's something that is disappointing, that we have such a greater infrastructure for the sharing of information, and it's a shame that so much of it is incorrect and faulty and feeding things like xenophobia as opposed to keeping us focused on the task at hand, which is looking after ourselves, looking after our loved ones, and contributing to our communities. But yes, Bruce is right on the money. There just wasn't, radio was not how information was traveling at that point. They do have the telegraph, so of course news is traveling, and again, that's going into the newspapers, as Bruce was suggesting. Before we go, so this is Nancy speaking, Bruce very kindly thanked me. I should be very clear, I consider this a great honor and a privilege to be sharing the microphone with Bruce, and also to be involved in an event hosted by Vashon Heritage Museum and Vashon Be Prepared. I adore the island, and it's just wonderful to have an opportunity to contribute even in the tiniest way and to stand alongside these folks who are truly the giants of the island. So thank you so much for including me.
Thank you. We're the ones who are honored to have you here. Elsa, you want to bring this to a close?
I do. I just want to say thank you to everybody, and there were some great questions here and comments, and a lot of thank yous to Nancy and Bruce. We will put this, as I mentioned, online, and we really appreciate both of you because I know that you put a lot of work and time and energy into this. Thank you. And that's all for now. Let me check 2 messages. And don't forget the Senior Center. Thank you, Senior Center.
Oh, of course, pardon me. Don't forget the Senior Center, of course. Their name isn't on my screen, so I forgot to thank the Senior Center, but there they are right there. Another important organization on our island.
And Vashon Be Prepared and For Culture. Thank you all very, very much. Okay, I think that's it.